The air in the big classroom always felt different. It wasn't just the smell of old wood and the lemony polish the cleaners used. It was the smell of money. It was in the way the students' shoes sparkled, never a scuff mark on them. It was in the soft rustle of their crisp, new uniforms. And for Maria, it was a constant reminder that she didn't quite belong. She sat near the back, her shoulders slightly hunched, trying to make herself invisible. Her shoes were polished, but you could still see the little lines where the leather had started to wear. Her uniform was clean, but the fabric wasn't as stiff and new as the others dot at the front of the room. A girl named Isabel was playing the big grand piano. Her fingers flew across the white and black keys, and the music that came out was perfect. Every note was in its place like a line of perfectly dressed soldiers. It was beautiful, but to Maria it felt a little empty. It was like looking at a beautiful painting of a sunset instead of watching a real one. The teacher, Mrs. Albright, stood beside the piano, her face looking proud. She was a tall, thin woman with her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her forehead. She clapped her hands sharply once and the music stopped. "Bravo, Isabel." "Absolutely flawless," Mrs. Albright said, her voice cutting through the silence. "That is what we aspire to, precision, elegance, control." Isabel beamed, giving a little practiced bow from her seat. A few of the other students clapped politely. Maria loved the piano more than anything. It was her secret. After school, when her mother was finished cleaning the classrooms, Maria would sneak into the small practice room at the end of the hall. It had an old upright piano that was a little out of tune, and the ivory on some of the keys was chipped. But to Maria, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She would play for hours, teaching herself songs she heard on the radio or making up her own little tunes. It was the only place where she didn't feel like the maid's daughter. She just felt like a musician, but here in this classroom she was just Maria, the girl who mopped the floors. Mrs. Albright's eyes swept across the room, looking over all the students. Her gaze was like a sharp knife, and Maria always tried to look down at her desk when it came her way. But this time the knife stopped. Mrs. Albright was looking right at her. A slow, almost cruel smile spread across the teacher's face. "But talent is not enough," Mrs. Albright said, her voice suddenly louder. "It must be shaped. It must be challenged. And some of us," she paused, letting her eyes linger on Maria, "need a little push to find out if they have what it takes." Maria's heart started to beat faster, a heavy thump, thump, thump against her ribs. She knew what was coming. It was a feeling she had gotten used to, a cold dread that washed over her. "Please no," she thought. "Please just look away." "Maria," Mrs. Albright said, her voice sharp and clear. "Stand up." A few snickers went through the classroom. Maria felt her face get hot. She slowly pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. She stood, keeping her eyes fixed on a spot on the wooden floor. "Come to the piano," Mrs. Albright commanded. Maria's feet felt like they were made of lead. She walked slowly between the rows of desks, feeling the eyes of every student on her. She could hear their whispers like little buzzing insects. "Look at her shoes. She's going to mess it up. Why does she even bother?" She wanted to turn around and run out of the room, but her legs kept moving forward. She finally reached the front of the class and stood next to the gleaming grand piano. It looked so much bigger and more intimidating up close. "Let's see what we have here," Mrs. Albright said to the class, but her eyes were on Maria. "Let's give everyone a chance to perform. After all," she said, her voice dripping with a sweet, fake kindness, "we are all here to learn. Go on, Maria, play something for us." Maria swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. "But Mrs. Albright, I haven't prepared anything," she whispered. "Nonsense." Mrs. Albright snapped, the kindness disappearing from her voice. "Music comes from the soul, not from a piece of paper. Show us your soul. Or perhaps," she said, turning to the class with a smirk, "you'd all like to see what happens when raw, untrained talent is put to the test." "Make her play," she announced to the room, her voice full of mockery. "She won't last a second." The class erupted in laughter. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was sharp and mean. Maria felt her hands start to shake. She looked out at the sea of faces, all of them smiling or laughing at her. She felt small and naked, like all her secrets were on display. She slowly sat on the piano bench. It was cold and hard. She placed her shaking fingers on the keys. They felt smooth and slippery. She tried to remember a simple song, one of the first ones she had taught herself on the old upright in the practice room. But her mind was a complete blank. All she could hear was the laughter, and all she could see was Mrs. Albright's smug face. She took a deep breath and pressed down on a key. Then another. The notes that came out were clumsy and loud, not at all like the soft melody in her head. She panicked. Her fingers fumbled, trying to find the right notes, but they just kept hitting the wrong ones. Then her pinky slipped and slammed down on a high, sharp note. It was a horrible, screeching sound that hung in the air like a bad smell. The laughter got louder. It was no longer just a few snickers. It was a full-blown roar. Maria's face felt like it was on fire. She snatched her hands away from the keys as if they had been burned and just sat there, her head bowed, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. "As I thought," Mrs. Albright said, her voice cutting through the laughter. It was filled with a sickening sense of victory. "A complete waste of time. Return to your seat, Maria. This is a class for musicians, not for maids to play around." Maria stood up and walked back to her desk without looking up. The laughter followed her the whole way. She sank into her chair and stared at her hands, the hands that had just betrayed her. They were the same hands that could make beautiful music late at night in an empty room. But here, in front of everyone, they were useless. The shame was a heavy weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She felt a hot tear escape and run down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. But underneath the shame and the hurt, something else was starting to flicker. A tiny hot spark of anger. It was small, but it was there. And for the first time all day, she didn't feel invisible. She just felt furious. The last bell of the day felt like a starting pistol for a race Maria had no desire to run. While the other students streamed out of the classrooms, their laughter echoing in the hallways, Maria moved slowly to her locker. The weight of the afternoon's humiliation felt like a physical thing, a heavy stone in her stomach. Every snicker she heard, real or imagined, felt like a fresh poke at the wound Mrs. Albright had opened. She changed out of her uniform and into her simple clothes, worn soft from many washings, and headed to the janitor's closet where her mother was already gathering her supplies. Her mother, Elena, was a woman whose back was permanently bent from years of scrubbing floors, but whose eyes were always kind. She saw the slump in her daughter's shoulders before she even saw her face. "Mia," she said softly, her voice gentle like a warm blanket. "You are late today." Maria just nodded, not trusting her own voice to speak. She took the mop bucket from her mother, the cool metal handle a small, familiar comfort in her hand. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the squeak of the mop on the polished hallway floors and the swish of their brooms. Maria tried to focus on the rhythmic motions, to lose herself in the work, but the scene in the music room kept playing in her head like a terrible movie on a loop. She saw the teacher's cruel smile, heard the explosion of laughter, felt the slick, slippery keys under her trembling fingers. The shame was a hot, prickly feeling that made her want to crawl into a dark corner and disappear. Finally, she couldn't hold it in anymore. She leaned on her mop, her shoulders shaking. "I want to quit," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I want to leave this school and never come back." Elena stopped sweeping and looked at her daughter. She didn't look surprised. She just looked sad. She walked over and put a calloused but gentle hand on Maria's back. "Why, Mia?" "This school, this music program, it was your dream." "It was a stupid dream," Maria said, her voice thick with tears. Mrs. Albright was right. I'm a joke. Everyone was laughing at me. They see me as just the cleaner's daughter who thinks she can play piano. I'll never be like them. I'll never be good enough. She wiped angrily at a tear that escaped down her cheek. "I hate it here." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She looked down the long, empty hallway, her eyes seeing something far away. When I was a little girl, she began, her voice soft and thoughtful, we had a radio in our village. It was a very old, big thing, and it only got one station. Most of the time, all you could hear was static, a hiss like a snake talking to itself. But sometimes, if you were patient, a song would come through the static. And when it was a good song, a song you loved, you didn't hear the static anymore. You only heard the music. The static was still there, but your heart was listening to the song. She looked back at Maria, her eyes full of a wisdom that had been earned through a lifetime of hard work. Those people, that teacher, they are the static, Mia. They're just noise. Don't you let them be the only thing you hear. You have to find your song and you have to play it so loud that's all anyone can hear. Don't let them be your static. Her mother's words settled into Maria's heart, but they didn't take the pain away. They just gave it a different shape. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud. The laughter, the mocking voice, the feeling of all those eyes on her. But then, a new feeling started to bubble up from underneath the shame. It was hot and sharp. It was anger. It was anger at the teacher for being so cruel, anger at the students for being so mean, and a deep, burning anger at herself for letting them see her cry, for freezing up like that. She wasn't just sad anymore. She was furious. She threw back the covers and slipped out of bed. An idea, reckless and desperate, was forming in her mind. She pulled on a sweater and jeans and tiptoed out of the house. The night air was cool on her face. She walked the familiar path back to the school, the big brick building looking like a sleeping giant under the moonlight. She knew a side door that was often left unlocked for the night watchman. With a deep breath, she slipped inside. The school was a completely different place at night. The hallways, usually so crowded and noisy, were vast and empty. Her footsteps were the only sound, echoing softly in the silence. She didn't go to the fancy music room with the grand piano. She went to the small, forgotten practice room at the end of the hall. She pushed the door open and there it was, the old upright piano. It was scarred and chipped, and some of the keys were yellowed with age. But to Maria, it looked like a friend. She sat on the wobbly bench and placed her fingers on the keys. The memory of the afternoon came flooding back, but this time it wasn't fear she felt. It was the fire of her anger. She thought of Mrs. Albright's smug face. She thought of the cruel laughter. She thought of the way her own hands had betrayed her. And then she began to play. She didn't play a song. She played her feelings. Her fingers, which had been trembling with fear that afternoon, were now strong with fury. She slammed down on the keys, creating a loud, crashing chord that echoed through the empty room. It was the sound of her frustration. Then her fingers softened, playing a quiet, weeping melody that was the sound of her hurt. The music was messy and raw. It was full of mistakes and discordant notes. It wasn't perfect like Isabel's playing. It was real. It was a fight. It was a storm. It was her crying out, not with tears, but with sound. She played until her fingers ached and her anger had been spent, transformed into something else. Something powerful. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a peaceful one. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had failed her that afternoon. But now they didn't feel like failures. They felt strong. They had found their voice. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not let the static win. The walk home that night was different. The cool night air didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt refreshing. The anger that had fueled her playing had burned away, leaving behind a quiet, steady warmth in her chest. For the first time since the humiliating incident in the music room, Maria didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a fighter. She had faced the ugly feeling inside her and had turned it into something, into sound. When she finally slipped back into her bed, her body was tired, but her mind was wide awake, replaying the raw, powerful music she had made. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was hers. The next day at school was a strange mix of exhaustion and secret excitement. She was tired, yes, her eyelids felt heavy during math class, but there was a new energy humming just beneath her skin. In the hallways, she still felt invisible, and in the music room, she was still just the maid's daughter. But now, she was a spy. She listened differently. When Isabel played a complicated piece by Bach, Maria didn't just hear the perfect notes. She listened to the spaces between the notes, the way Isabel's fingers struck the keys with sharp, exact precision. It was impressive, like a machine cutting perfect shapes out of metal. But Maria couldn't feel the heart in it. It was beautiful, but it was cold. That night she went back. And the night after that. A quiet routine began to form. After her mother fell asleep, Maria would slip out of the house, the familiar path to the school now a comforting journey. She learned which side door the old night watchman, a kind man with a soft smile and tired eyes, would forget to lock. He never said a word to her, but he knew. Sometimes she would find a small thermos of hot chocolate sitting on the floor just inside the door, still warm. It was a silent pact, a tiny act of kindness that made her feel less alone in her secret world. The old practice room became her sanctuary, her laboratory. At first she just played what she felt, letting her fingers wander and tell the story of her day. The heavy, tired bass notes were the sound of her mother scrubbing floors. The high, lonely melody was the sound of her own heart walking through the crowded hallways. The loud, crashing chords were her anger at Mrs. Albright's cruel words. It was a language only she and the piano understood, but she knew that feelings alone weren't enough. She needed to learn the language of music, the rules, and the structures. One night, while exploring a dusty storage cupboard, she found a stack of old, tattered music books. They were yellowed and smelled of time, with notes that looked like tiny black ants crawling across the page. Some were simple beginner books, but others were collections of famous composers. She pulled them out, her heart pounding with excitement. Her practice changed. She started with the simple books, teaching herself to read the notes, to understand the rhythm and timing. It was frustrating. Her fingers would stumble, her brain would get confused, and she would hit wrong notes that sounded like little shrieks in the silent room. There were nights she wanted to give up, to just go back to playing her raw, emotional tunes. But then she would remember Mrs. Albright's face, the laughter of the class, and the feeling of determination would harden inside her again. She began to challenge herself. She would listen to the advanced students play their pieces during the day, memorizing the sound, and then she would go home at night and try to play them from the old books she'd found. It was a struggle. A piece by a composer named Chopin, full of fast, tricky notes, took her 2 weeks to master. The first few nights, it was a mess. Her fingers felt like clumsy sausages. But she didn't quit. She broke it down, playing one hand at a time, over and over, until her fingers ached. And then something magical started to happen. As her fingers learned the patterns, her heart started to pour into the music. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page anymore. She was playing her version of the song. Where the other students played the Chopin piece with a light, pretty sound, Maria played it with a deep, longing sadness. She wasn't just playing notes. She was playing all the nights she felt alone, all the times she wished she could be someone else. The music that came out was not technically perfect, but it was alive. It breathed with her own experiences. Her secret symphonies became more complex. She would play for hours, losing track of time, until the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the tall windows of the academy. She would play until her fingers were numb and her back ached from sitting on the wobbly bench. The piano was no longer just an instrument to her. It was a friend, a confidant, the one place in the world where she was completely herself. She wasn't the maid's daughter. She wasn't the girl who couldn't last a second. She was a musician, and the empty hall was her concert hall. The silence of the night was her audience, and she was determined to make it listen. She was no longer just practicing to get better. She was practicing for a day when she would have to play for others again, and this time she would be ready. This time they would not hear the static. They would only hear her song. The announcement for the winter recital was posted on the main bulletin board, a big, fancy sheet of cream-colored paper with elegant gold lettering. It was the most important event of the school year, a night when parents and important people from the city came to watch the best students perform. Maria saw it as she walked by, her heart sinking a little. It was a world she felt she could only watch from the outside. A few days later, Mrs. Albright made the announcement in class. She stood at the front, a self-satisfied smile on her face as she read out the names and the order of performers. Maria didn't even bother to listen, assuming she wouldn't be a part of it. But then she heard her name. "And opening the show," Mrs. Albright said, her voice laced with a sweetness that was pure poison. "We have a special performance by Maria." A few students glanced back at her, their expressions a mix of pity and amusement. The first slot was known as the graveyard slot. It was given to the weakest students, a way to get them out of the way before the judges and most of the audience had settled into their seats. It was a public declaration of insignificance. "A fitting place to begin, I think," Mrs. Albright added, her eyes meeting Maria's with a look of pure satisfaction. "To get the simpler pieces out of the way." The room felt very small. Maria could feel a familiar panic rising in her chest, the same cold dread she had felt the day she was mocked in front of everyone. But this time something was different. Underneath the fear, a tiny, stubborn fire was burning. She thought of the countless nights spent in the dusty practice room, her fingers aching, her heart pouring into the music. She thought of her mother's words about the static. This wasn't just a performance slot. It was a challenge. The days leading up to the recital were a blur of nervous energy. Maria's secret practice sessions became even more intense. She wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was preparing for a battle. The old upright in the practice room was her training ground. She chose a piece she had heard an older student play once, a piece full of fire and passion, a storm of sound that felt like it was made for her. It was technically difficult, but more than that, it required emotion. It required a story. Every night she poured her own story into the music. The fast, angry runs of notes were her frustration with Mrs. Albright and the snickering students. The slow, haunting melodies were her loneliness, the feeling of being invisible. And the powerful, crashing chords were her defiance, her refusal to be silenced. She played until her fingers felt like they would fall off, until the music was so much a part of her that she could hear it in her head even when she was away from the piano. Her mother, Elena, saw the change in her. She saw the dark circles under her daughter's eyes, but she also saw a new light in them, a look of fierce determination. The night before the recital, Maria took out the only nice dress she owned, a simple blue one she had worn to a cousin's wedding a few years ago. It was a little snug on her now. Without a word, Elena took it from her. That night, long after Maria had gone to bed, Elena sat in the living room with a needle and thread, carefully letting out the seams. She added a tiny white lace trim to the collar that she had saved from an old blouse of her own. It was her way of telling her daughter that she was there, that she believed in her even if she couldn't say the words. The day of the recital felt strange and unreal. The school was filled with a nervous, excited energy. Students in their finest clothes rushed past, their parents trailing behind them. Maria felt like a ghost moving through it all. She put on her dress, now feeling perfect and comfortable, and her mother carefully braided her hair. They didn't have a car, so they walked to the school together under the streetlights. The whole way, Elena didn't say much. She just squeezed Maria's hand, a silent gesture of support that meant more than any speech could. Backstage was chaos. People were running around, tuning instruments and whispering nervously. Maria found a small corner and tried to make herself small. She could hear the murmur of the audience growing on the other side of the heavy velvet curtain. Her hands were cold and sweaty. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought it might jump out of her chest. The fear was back, a giant monster trying to swallow her whole. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to remember the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the sound of the music filling the empty hall. Just then, Mrs. Albright swept by. She stopped in front of Maria, her eyes looking her up and down. "Remember your place, Maria," she said, her voice a low, cold whisper. "Just play your little song and don't waste anyone's time." Then she was gone, leaving a chill in the air. Maria felt a surge of anger, hot and bright. That anger was the anchor she needed. She wasn't going to let that woman win. A stagehand peeked his head around the corner. "You're on," he said. Maria walked to the edge of the stage. The bright lights hit her, blinding her. She couldn't see the audience, just a vast, dark space. She walked to the grand piano, the same one she had humiliated herself at months ago. It felt different now. It didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a partner. She sat down on the bench, its smooth, cool surface a small comfort. She peeked through the glare of the lights and scanned the back rows. And then she saw her. Her mother, sitting in the very last row, leaning forward, her hands clasped together tightly. She wasn't looking at the stage. She was looking right at Maria, and her face was full of a love and belief so strong it felt like a physical force. Maria took another deep breath. She thought of the static, the noise, the laughter, and then she thought of her song. She placed her fingers on the keys, and she began to play. The first notes were a shock. They were loud and sharp, cutting through the quiet murmurs of the audience. People who were still finding their seats stopped and turned to look. The music that came out was not just a collection of notes. It was a story. It was a storm of emotion. It was the sound of a girl who had been underestimated, who had been laughed at, but who had refused to break. The fast, furious passages were filled with a raw power that made the air vibrate. The slow, soft sections were so full of aching sadness that you could hear a pin drop in the auditorium. People who were walking down the aisles froze in their tracks. The judges, who had been casually looking over their programs, put them down and leaned forward, their expressions rapt. Mrs. Albright, sitting in the front row, her face a mask of bored expectation, suddenly looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. This was not the simple, clumsy performance she had been expecting. This was something else entirely. This was magic. Maria played with everything she had. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the technique anymore. She was just feeling. She was pouring all the lonely nights, all the secret practice, all the anger, and all the hope into the piano. The music swelled, rising and falling like a great tide. It was a fight, a conversation, a prayer. And then, as the piece reached its climax, she poured all her newfound strength into the final, thundering chords. The sound filled the huge hall, echoing off the walls and ceiling. A final, defiant roar, and then there was silence, a complete, utter, breathless silence. Maria sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her fingers still hovering over the keys. For a moment, the world was completely still. And then a single person started clapping. Then another and another. It grew into a wave, a tidal wave of sound so loud it was deafening. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar of appreciation, of shock, of awe. The entire audience was on their feet. Maria looked out, her vision blurred by the lights and the tears that were now streaming down her face. She saw her mother, still standing in the back row, clapping and crying, her face shining with pride. In that moment, Maria knew she had done it. She had found her song, and she had made the whole world listen. The sound that hit her was like a physical force. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar, a living thing made of hundreds of people all on their feet, their faces turned towards her. For a moment, Maria just sat there, her fingers still resting on the keys, her mind struggling to catch up. The world had been silent, and now it was exploding. The bright lights of the stage blurred through the tears that were now freely streaming down her face. These weren't tears of sadness or shame. They were tears of relief, of a pressure so immense finally being released. She saw her mother in the back row, still standing, her hands clasped to her heart, her face a mess of happy tears. In that single look, Maria saw everything she needed to see. Her mother's pride was a warm, steady light that cut through all the noise, a stagehand. A young man with a kind smile gently touched her shoulder. "You have to bow," he whispered. "They won't stop." Bow. The word felt foreign. She wasn't a performer who took bows. She was a girl who hid in the shadows. But she stood up on shaky legs and turned to face the wall of sound. She gave a small, awkward nod, not a practiced bow, and the applause seemed to get even louder. It was a wave of acceptance, a welcome she had never dreamed of. As she walked off the stage, the world tilted on its axis. Backstage was no longer a place of lonely waiting. It was buzzing with energy. Students who had never looked at her before now stared with wide, amazed eyes. Some whispered to each other, pointing at her. One girl, a violinist who had always been polite but distant, gave her a genuine, warm smile. "That was, incredible," she said, her voice full of wonder. Maria just nodded, not trusting her voice, a feeling of unreality washing over her. She was trying to find her way through the small crowd when a man approached her. He was older, with a neatly trimmed white beard and kind, intelligent eyes. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, and he carried himself with a quiet authority. Maria recognized him from the program. He was a famous composer, one of the most important judges at the recital. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm but powerful, "I have been attending these recitals for 20 years, and I have never heard anything like that." Maria felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "No," he said, shaking his head gently. "Thank you. We hear so many technically perfect performances. Flawless, beautiful, but often empty. They are like beautiful empty rooms. But you filled the entire hall. You didn't just play the notes. You told us a story. You played with a soul that has been through something. That is not something that can be taught. That is a gift." He paused, looking at her with a serious expression. "My foundation offers a full scholarship to a special music conservatory for one young artist each year. It's a place where they don't just teach you how to play better. They teach you how to find your voice and use it. I would be honored if you would consider accepting it this year." Maria just stared at him, her mouth slightly open. A scholarship, a real one, to a place where people like him thought she belonged. It was too much to take in. It was a dream so big she had never even allowed herself to dream it. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," he said with a warm smile. "And come and play for us again, very soon." He handed her a card with his name and a number on it, then gave her a small, respectful nod and moved away. Maria stood there, clutching the small card in her hand like it was a winning lottery ticket. Her eyes scanned the room and then fell on the front row of the auditorium, where she could see Mrs. Albright. The teacher was still in her seat, but she looked small and pale. The headmaster of the academy, a stern man who usually doted on her, was standing over her. He wasn't shouting. He was just looking at her with an expression of profound disappointment, and then he turned his back on her completely, walking away to congratulate another student. The parents around Mrs. Albright were ignoring her, their faces still turned towards the stage, talking excitedly about the performance they had just witnessed. She was an island of silence in a sea of celebration. Her power, which had always come from her position and her ability to judge others, had vanished. In the face of Maria's raw, undeniable talent, she had been proven not just wrong, but insignificant. There was no dramatic scene, no public firing. There was only the quiet, crushing defeat of a person whose entire world had just been proven to be a lie, but Maria didn't have time to focus on her. A familiar voice cut through the noise. "Mia!" It was her mother, pushing her way through the crowd that had now gathered backstage. Elena's eyes were red-rimmed, but her face was glowing with a pride so fierce it seemed to light up the space around her. She didn't say anything else. She just wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tight. Maria buried her face in her mother's shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of soap and the faint, clean smell of the cleaning supplies she used all day. In her mother's arms, she wasn't a musical prodigy or the star of the show. She was just Maria, and she was safe. "They heard you, Mia," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she stroked Maria's hair. "The whole world heard you." Maria pulled back, looking at her mother's face. "We did it," she said, her voice finally strong and clear. "We did it together." Later that night, after the crowds had gone and the school was quiet again, Maria sat with her mother at their small kitchen table. The scholarship letter felt unreal in her hands, a promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. It was a life-changing opportunity, a ticket out of the life of being invisible. But as she looked across the table at her mother, who was watching her with a tired but happy smile, Maria knew that the scholarship wasn't the real prize. The real prize was the quiet strength she now felt inside herself. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone. In its place was a calm, steady confidence. She had walked into the lion's den, armed with nothing but her heart and her secret practice, and she had tamed the lion. She had found her voice, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that no one would ever again dare to tell her to be silent. The static was gone, and all that was left was her music, clear and strong, ready to be heard by the world.